Less than a week after moving into my new home, the weirdness began. I'd just settled into this old ranch-style house on the outskirts of town, a place I'd snagged for a bargain. The realtor, Thomas, had told me the previous owner was eager to sell due to a family emergency. Regardless of the reason, I was just glad I could afford it. The house wasn't perfect, but its charm was in its creaks and groans. First time I heard it, I was in bed, unwinding after a long day of unpacking. It was nearly midnight when I caught the faintest sound of whispering coming from the basement. I froze, straining to listen, but the noise was so muffled, I convinced myself it was just my mind playing tricks. But then it came again, a soft, indistinct murmur, just loud enough to grab my attention. Curious, I got up and walked to the basement door, pressing my ear against the wood. There it was again, faint, rhythmic whispering, like someone speaking in hushed tones. My hand hovered over the doorknob, hesitating. The basement was secured with a thick, rusted padlock. The same one I'd seen when Tomas first showed me the house. I remembered the basement clearly, dusty, cluttered with cobwebs and old boxes. It struck me as odd that the padlock had been put back on after the tour. Shaking my head, I thought I must be losing my mind. I went back to bed, ignoring the whispers and burying my head under a pillow as I lay on my stomach. For the next few nights, the whispering returned at the same time, just past midnight. I'd lie in bed, trying to block it out, but the soft, unintelligible murmurs were impossible to ignore. I convinced myself it was just the house, settling, or maybe a trapped animal, but it was too deliberate, too steady to be random. One night, I'd had enough. I grabbed my flashlight and approached the basement door, pressing my ear against the cool wood once more. The whispering was still there, faint and insistent. I shined my light around, the beam flickering over chipped paint and a dusty floor. My fingers grazed the cold, rusted padlock, sending a chill down my spine. Why was the basement locked up so securely? I realized that the key to the padlock was on the bundle of keys Tomas had given me. Carefully, I unlocked the padlock, realizing that the house had fallen silent. No more whispers, nothing. The door creaked open, revealing a dark staircase leading into the basement. I couldn't find the light switch, so I descended slowly, sweeping my flashlight across the dim space. The only sound was the creaking of the stairs beneath me, and my heart pounded so hard I could hear it echoing in my ears. At the bottom, I shined the light around. Cobwebs draped the corners, and a few boxes were piled against the wall, but there was nothing, no sign of anything that could be responsible for the whispering. Suddenly, I caught a glimpse of a pale foot disappearing behind the stairs. A chill shot down my spine. Swallowing my fear, I aimed the flashlight in that direction and cautiously moved closer. Under the stairs was a freestanding storage unit with some old boxes and rusty tools, leftovers from the previous owners. There was no place for anyone to hide, no secret door, no closet, just open space. But as I swept the light around, I felt an unsettling presence, that creeping feeling when the hairs on your neck stand on end and a chill crawl over your skin. Instinctively, I looked up, even as my flashlight remained pointed at the ground. In the dim glow, I saw her, a woman in tattered clothes clinging to the ceiling, her back to me, but her head twisted at an unnatural angle, staring right at me. I gasped, frozen in shock and disbelief. Before I could react, she leapt toward me, unleashing a bone-chilling shriek. I dropped the flashlight and bolted up the stairs, running faster than I ever had in my life. I slammed the door shut, just as a heavy thud hit it from the other side, as if something had crashed into it at full speed. My hands shook as I quickly bolted and locked the door. I stumbled back, my eyes fixed on the basement door, paralyzed with horror. I couldn't believe what I had just witnessed. The whispering started up again, but it had changed. I could almost make out the words, and then, clear as day, I heard it. It was a breathy whisper, unmistakably my name. I stumbled back against the wall, my heart hammering in my chest. I ran to my bedroom, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination, but the fear felt too real. The next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling. I called Thomas and asked bluntly, "Is there something I should know about this house?" I reminded him that he was legally required to disclose any information about the property and not withhold anything just to make a sale. He sighed, sounding weary. "Sir, I've already given you all the information I have about the property. If you'd like, you can stop by my office and we can go over any concerns you might have." The next morning, I met Thomas at a coffee shop near my workplace. I only had a few minutes before I had to rush off to the office, but I needed answers. Why did the previous owner leave so suddenly? What was this family emergency all about? I asked, getting straight to the point. Thomas hesitated, his demeanor shifting. He mentioned that his wife had passed away, and he wanted to move the kids closer to their grandparents for support. When did she die? And how? I pressed, sensing there was more to the story. He shifted uncomfortably, his eyes flitting away from mine. "I think it was about 5 years ago," he said, his tone uncertain. That didn't sit right with me. Why live in the house for 5 years and then suddenly decide to leave? It didn't add up. How did she die? I repeated, trying to pierce through his vague responses. "I'm not exactly sure," Thomas mumbled, stirring his coffee with deliberate distraction, still refusing to meet my eyes. "I'll find out and let you know what I can." Sensing there was more he wasn't telling me, and aware I was running late, I thanked him for his time and hurried off. One thing was clear. I needed to dig deeper into the house's history. Thomas was definitely hiding something. In my spare time, I searched anything related to that property I could find on the internet. I searched the seller's name, but got nothing. As a last-ditch effort, I decided to visit the local bar, a quaint, family-owned place where everyone came for a drink and the latest gossip. After chatting casually with Claudia, the owner, I brought up my new house. The lively atmosphere instantly shifted, the bar fell silent, and every set of eyes turned toward me. "Why do you ask?" Claudia asked cautiously. "That's the place I told you about earlier, the one I just bought. I moved in last week," I said, puzzled by the sudden tension in the room. "What's going on?" I pressed, looking around at the faces now turned away, avoiding my gaze. Claudia cleared her throat, exchanged a quick glance with her husband, then shook her head. "Nothing," she said, her voice tight as she busied herself wiping down the nearby tables. "Excuse me, but what aren't you telling me?" I insisted, my frustration growing. It was clear they were hiding something, and I was tired of being kept in the dark. Just then, a young man stormed out from the kitchen. "Just tell him, Mom. He's going to find out anyway," he snapped. Claudia threw up her hands, a gesture of surrender, and retreated behind the bar. The man approached, extending his hand. "Hi, I'm Adam, Claudia's son." He pulled up a chair, sat down across from me, and tossed his tea towel over his shoulder, eyeing the room before speaking. "Did you ever meet Jack, the previous owner of your house?" he asked. I shook my head, indicating no. "Well, Jack moved in about 7 years ago, I think," Adam said, glancing around at the other patrons. A few nodded, as if they knew exactly what was coming next. Adam continued, The house had been abandoned for years and needed serious work to be habitable. Jack spent almost a year fixing it up, trying to preserve the original features while adding some modern touches. He and his wife, Eva, used to drop by here on weekends when they could. The stories they told us about that place were strange. Some of us thought they were just making it up, but my dad and uncle, who've lived in this town forever, knew the house's history. They weren't so quick to dismiss the tales. Adam paused, wiping his brow with a tea towel before continuing. Adam leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper, as if he were about to share a secret. Jack and Eva said the house was haunted, he said, watching me closely, trying to gauge my reaction. So, what do you think? Sound familiar? Do you agree with the whole haunting thing? He pressed, raising an eyebrow. I hesitated, feeling the weight of every gaze in the bar pressing on me. I'd been hearing strange whispers from the basement. Noises I couldn't place until last night, when I finally saw what was making them. I said quietly, my eyes darting around the room. I half expected them to laugh or brush me off, but no one did. They just sat there, eyes fixed on me, as if they were watching a scene unfold on TV. Beers in hand and snacks forgotten. What do you mean? Adam asked, looking stunned. I went down there to investigate the whispering that's been haunting me since I moved in. There was something on the ceiling, watching me. The moment I noticed it, it lunged at me, shrieking. It all happened so fast. I just ran and locked the door. I finished, feeling awkward. Adam stared at me, mouth hanging open. He shook his head before continuing. Well, then what I'm about to tell you might not sound so crazy after what you've been through. Jack and Eva stayed because they'd poured all their money into fixing up that place. Jack had been hoping to get a job in Chicago, and after nearly 2 years, he finally did. But just before they were about to leave, Eva disappeared. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. In those 2 years, they saw things, Adam continued. Jack and Eva would talk about shadows that seemed to move on their own, rooms that would suddenly turn icy cold, and waking up to see a dark figure lurking in the corner. They'd hear whispers through the walls, a woman's laughter, or feel someone standing behind them, only to turn around and find no one there. I swallowed hard, barely able to believe what I was hearing. They both experienced this, even the kids. Adam nodded solemnly. Yeah, the kids too, he said, pausing to let the weight of it settle. Things would disappear and reappear in odd places, Adam continued. It got worse when both girls started having the same nightmare over and over. They kept dreaming of a woman who was asking them to go with her. One night, their youngest, Sophia, woke up her parents to tell them that Sarah wasn't in her bed. They searched the whole house and finally found her standing in the basement, staring blankly at the wall. She was sleepwalking, he said.
Poor things,
Claudia murmured, her voice tinged with sympathy.
Eva was beside herself with worry.
Sarah didn't remember a thing about that night, Adam went on. Jack recalled that when they first moved in, the basement door was padlocked shut. He thought it was strange at the time, but after finding Sarah down there, they decided to put the padlock back on. It seemed to help. Things quieted down, and the family felt some relief. They figured they'd just keep the basement closed and locked until they could move out. Adam leaned back, his eyes scanning the room before settling back on me. After Jack got the job in Chicago, his boss asked him to stay a few more months to help train his replacement. Eva was furious. She wanted out immediately and told Jack they needed to leave, or she'd take the kids and stay with her sister. That night, Eva slept in the girls' room. The next morning, she was gone. Vanished, without a trace. Adam made a quick flick of his hand, mimicking something disappearing into thin air. Did they ever find her? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. No, Adam said grimly. The local sheriff launched an investigation, searched the house from top to bottom, but they found nothing. Jack stayed behind for nearly 6 months, searching, but eventually he had to leave to take care of his daughters, who were staying with his parents. He put the house up for sale about 2.5 years after buying it. Every time a potential buyer learned about the house's history, they backed out. Until you, that is. He gave me a pointed wink. What did you mean earlier when you said your dad and uncle knew about the house's history? About it being haunted? What's the story? I asked, unable to contain my curiosity. Adam smirked, glancing around at the other patrons. Some shook their heads while others snickered, as if sharing some unspoken joke. You've got a good ear. You picked up on that, huh? Yeah, there's a story behind it, he said, his tone shifting, heavy with a mix of reluctance and amusement. As the story goes, about 20 years ago, a doctor named Charles Williams moved to town. He set up his practice, and the community welcomed him with open arms, grateful to have a doctor nearby. But soon after, women began to disappear, always the same type, tall, blonde, and in their 30s, Adam explained, pausing as an elderly man who had been quietly listening chimed in.
The sheriff couldn't solve a damn thing. Useless lot. They never found any bodies, and without them, they were stuck.
The old man grumbled, his toothless mouth twisted in disdain. Adam nodded and continued. Charles got sloppy, or maybe just too arrogant. One of his captives managed to escape. He'd forgotten to lock the basement door. Jane, chained to the wall, had witnessed unspeakable horrors as he tortured another woman on a makeshift surgery table. When Charles went upstairs, Jane seized her chance. She slipped her wrist free of the chain, crept up the stairs, and found him passed out on the living room sofa. She bolted to the nearest neighbor and told the sheriff everything. When they raided the house, Charles was still asleep. The remains of the woman were exactly where Jane said they'd be, on the table in the basement. He was caught red-handed, but he never revealed where he'd hidden the other victims. They suspect he was responsible for at least 15 disappearances over 5 years, Adam finished. Did they ever search the basement for more bodies? I asked, feeling a chill creep up my spine. Adam shrugged and glanced at the old man, who had since nodded off in his chair. No idea, uncle, but the question went unanswered. Well, anything else you want to know? Adam asked, stretching in his chair, but I was too stunned to respond. I simply shook my head, still reeling from everything I'd just heard. Adam got up and strolled back to the kitchen, whistling as if he hadn't just told me the most terrifying story of my life. I sat there, my mind racing, struggling to make sense of the nightmare I'd walked into. Without a word, I bolted out of the bar. The sun had already set, and darkness had taken over. I rushed back to the house, the dread settling in deeper with every step. There was no way I was spending another night there. As soon as I stepped inside, I heard banging against the basement door. It rattled and shook, vibrating as if it would come off its hinges at any moment. I packed quickly, my hands trembling as I threw clothes into a bag. Adam's story played on a loop in my mind. 15 women, lost forever. The basement seemed to pulse beneath me, as if it were alive, waiting. Just as I zipped up my bag, I heard it again, the whisper, faint but unmistakable.
Please help us.
I froze, heart racing, my eyes flicking to the basement door. The iron bars vibrated faintly, humming with an energy that felt ancient and unyielding. It hit me then. Those bars weren't just meant to keep people out. They were meant to keep something in. I snatched my keys and fled without a backward glance. As I drove away, the whisper echoed in my ears, a sad, desperate plea that I knew would haunt me long after I'd left that cursed house behind. It was a Friday night, and I was driving home from a friend's place after a long day of work. We had hung out a little later than usual, just talking, playing video games, and watching TV. By the time I left, it was past midnight. I was tired, but I knew the drive home was only about 20 minutes if I took the back roads. I've driven those roads 100 times before. They were dark, empty, and a little creepy, but they were also the quickest way home. The rain had started pouring not long after I left, coming down in sheets, making it hard to see more than a few feet in front of my car. My windshield wipers were working overtime, but the headlights barely cut through the darkness. The road was winding and narrow, lined with thick trees that seemed to swallow any light, making the whole drive feel like I was going through a tunnel. I was about 10 minutes from home when I saw her, a woman standing on the side of the road. She was wearing a long white dress that clung to her body, drenched from the rain. Her hair was long and dark, hanging over her face like she'd been standing out there for hours. She wasn't waving or trying to flag me down. She was just standing there, facing the road, her head slightly tilted. I slowed down as I got closer, my heart rate picking up. There was no reason for anyone to be out there in the middle of the night, especially in this weather. My first thought was that she might be in trouble. Maybe her car had broken down, or she'd gotten lost. But as I rolled my window down a crack, the cold air and rain immediately rushed in, sending a shiver through me. "Hey, do you need help?" I called out, trying to sound calm even though something about her presence made me uneasy. She didn't respond. She didn't even look at me. She just kept standing there, staring at the road. I could barely make out her face under her hair, but what I could see looked pale and lifeless, like all the color had been drained away. I squinted, trying to get a better look, when she slowly raised her arm and pointed down the road, her movements slow and mechanical, almost unnatural. I followed her gesture. There was only darkness. When I looked back at her, she finally spoke, but it was barely above a whisper.
Don't go that way.
She said. Her voice was soft, almost drowned out by the sound of the rain hitting the car roof. But there was something about the way she said it that sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't a plea or a warning. It was like she was stating a fact, as if she knew something I didn't. I just stared at her, feeling this deep, unsettling sense of dread building in my chest. I thought about getting out, maybe offering her a ride, but something in my gut told me to keep my distance. I nodded slightly, rolled my window back up, and drove off, my tires splashing through puddles as I sped away. Ahead, the road forked into two. After hesitating for a second, I chose to take the road on the left, instead adding another 10 minutes to my journey. Better safe than sorry, I suppose. As I drove, I couldn't get the image of her out of my head. The soaking wet dress, the lifeless eyes, the way she pointed without ever really looking at me. I glanced in my rearview mirror, expecting to see her silhouette fading into the night, but she was gone. It was like she'd vanished the second I'd driven away. I tried to push it out of my mind, telling myself it was just some lost traveler, or maybe a prank, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The road felt even darker and more oppressive than before, and I found myself gripping the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles white. Every shadow seemed to move, and every gust of wind rattled my nerves. The next morning, I turned on the news while having my coffee, and my stomach dropped when I saw the headline, "Fatal Accident on River Road." My heart started pounding as the reporter described how a car had gone off the road around midnight, skidding on the wet pavement and crashing into a ditch filled with water. The driver was trapped and drowned before help could arrive. The location they were describing was the exact spot where I'd seen the woman. The hair on the back of my neck stood up as they showed footage of the crash site, police lights flashing, the car's twisted frame barely visible under the tarp. I couldn't stop thinking about what the woman had said. Don't go that way. If I hadn't listened to her, that could have been me. But as I tried to make sense of it, something else caught my attention. The news showed a photo of the crash victim, a young woman with long dark hair and pale skin. My heart skipped a beat. She looked eerily familiar. She looked like the woman I'd seen on the road, almost exactly the same, down to the white dress. But there was one problem. The police said her legs were crushed and would have needed help to leave the car. I tried to rationalize it, to convince myself that I must have seen someone else, but deep down, I knew the truth. I'd seen her, standing on the side of the road, drenched in rain, warning me not to keep driving. I haven't taken those back roads since. I stick to the main routes, even if it means a longer drive. But every once in a while, when it's late at night and the roads are empty, I think about her, about that pale face staring into the darkness, that whispered warning, and the impossible reality that I had seen a ghost trying to save me from the fate she couldn't escape. Now, when I'm out driving at night, I can't help but watch the roadside, half expecting to see her again. I keep wondering if she's still out there, trying to warn someone else, standing alone in the rain, forever trapped on that dark, winding road. I grew up in a small town where there wasn't much to do. When you live in a place where the most exciting thing is a Walmart, you learn to make your own fun. For my friends and me, that usually meant exploring the abandoned places around town, old factories, run-down barns, and our favorite spot, an old farmhouse about 5 miles outside of town. The farmhouse had been abandoned for as long as anyone could remember. It sat alone at the end of a long, overgrown driveway, hidden behind a row of tall, dead trees. The house was falling apart, windows shattered, paint peeling, and the porch sagging like it would collapse at any moment. There were all kinds of stories about it. Some people said it was haunted, others said it was cursed. But to us, it was just a creepy old house where we could hang out and get a good scare. One summer night, my friends and I decided to head back there. It was just after sunset, and the sky was turning that deep, dark blue that always made the house look even more ominous. We parked at the end of the driveway, the car's headlights cutting through the weeds and casting long, eerie shadows that seemed to move on their own. There were 4 of us. Me, my buddy Chris, his girlfriend Jenny, and her friend Ashley. We were armed with flashlights, phones, and a baseball bat we brought for no reason other than to feel a little safer. As we made our way up the driveway, the farmhouse loomed in front of us, its broken windows staring like empty eyes. The place had this heavy, unsettling silence about it, like the kind you find in graveyards late at night. Every step we took was met with the crunch of gravel and the rustle of dead leaves, echoing louder than it should have. Chris was in the lead, swinging the bat like he was ready to take on anything that jumped out at us, while Jenny and Ashley whispered nervously behind us. When we reached the front porch, we stopped. The wooden steps groaned under our weight, and the air smelled like mold and damp wood. The front door was already half open, hanging off its hinges like it hadn't been touched in years. Chris gave me a look, grinning like he was enjoying this way more than the rest of us. "Ladies first," he joked, nudging Jenny, who just rolled her eyes. We stepped inside, and the first thing that hit me was the smell, stale and musty, like the place had been rotting from the inside out. Floor was covered in dust, broken glass, and scattered debris. Old, faded wallpaper peeled off the walls in long strips, revealing dark stains underneath that looked suspiciously like water damage, or worse. We made our way through the house, shining our flashlights around. The beams of light danced across old, dusty furniture, cobwebs, and doorways that led into pitch-black rooms. The place was even creepier on the inside. Every corner seemed to hide something, and the shadows felt deeper, like they were waiting to swallow us whole. We tried to keep things light, joking and daring each other to go upstairs, but there was this constant, nagging feeling that we weren't alone. Chris was leading the way when he stopped suddenly, holding his hand up to signal us to be quiet. I froze, my heart skipping a beat as I listened. At first, I couldn't hear anything over the sound of my own breathing, but then I caught it, a faint creaking sound coming from upstairs. It was slow and deliberate, like someone was walking across the floorboards, trying not to be heard. We all exchanged nervous glances. There was no way anyone else could be in here. We hadn't seen another car for miles. Chris, always the bravest, or maybe just the most reckless, gestured for us to follow him as he headed toward the staircase. As we climbed the creaky wooden steps, the air grew colder, and the sounds from above seemed to stop. We reached the top landing, where the hallway stretched into darkness, the walls lined with old, broken picture frames and faded family photos that were too warped to make out. The door to the master bedroom was slightly ajar, just wide enough to make you wonder what was on the other side. Chris pushed it open, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The room was mostly empty, except for a rocking chair, which strangely was moving slightly, and a large, dusty mirror leaning against the far wall. It was one of those old-fashioned mirrors with an ornate frame covered in grime and cobwebs. But what really caught our attention was the figure standing in the field just beyond the window. It was hard to see clearly through the cracked glass, but there was definitely someone out there. A tall, thin figure, dressed in tattered clothes that fluttered slightly in the breeze. He was facing the house, unmoving, though his features were obscured by shadows. There was something unmistakably wrong about him, like he didn't quite belong in the world of the living. "Who the hell is that?" Ashley whispered, her voice barely audible. None of us answered. We were all too fixated on the figure. Chris tapped the window with the bat, but the figure didn't react. It just stood there, staring up at us, or maybe staring through us. The air felt thick, heavy with the kind of tension that made every instinct scream to get out. But none of us moved. We were frozen, caught between fear and morbid curiosity. Suddenly, Chris's flashlight flickered and went out, plunging us into near darkness. We fumbled with our phones, trying to get some light, but the batteries were drained, something that hadn't happened all night. Panic set in, and we bolted out of the room, stumbling down the stairs as the old house seemed to close in around us. I glanced back just once and saw the mirror again, only this time there was something in it. The reflection showed the room, empty except for the dusty furniture and the rocking chair. Sitting in the chair, rocking slowly back and forth, was a shadow, a tall, thin figure with hollow, empty eyes. It was the same figure we'd seen in the field, now impossibly inside the house, watching us. We didn't stop running until we were back in the car, doors slammed and locked, hearts racing. I looked back at the house one last time as Chris floored the gas, the headlights briefly illuminating the porch. For a split second, I thought I saw someone standing there, tall, thin, and still as a statue, just like before. But as quickly as we drove past, he was gone, swallowed up by the night. The next day, I did some digging, hoping to make sense of what we'd seen. I found old newspaper articles about the farmhouse, stories that went back decades. The last owner was a man named Thomas Crane, a farmer who'd vanished under mysterious circumstances. His family had reported him missing. Thomas was never seen again. He was known to be a heavy drinker with a violent temper. As his sons grew older, they learned to protect their mother from his outbursts. Now, there are many versions of his fate. Some say he ran off, while others whisper more sinister rumors. But the truth is, no one really knows what happened to him. The house had been abandoned ever since. I haven't been back to that farmhouse, and I don't plan to. But sometimes, when I'm driving past those fields late at night, I think I see something standing just beyond the trees, a figure watching, waiting, as if guarding the old, decaying secrets of a place that should have been left alone. I still see his face in my dreams, those empty eyes staring through me, and I can't shake the feeling that we weren't just exploring an abandoned house that night. We were intruding on something we weren't meant to find. I used to work at an office in downtown Manhattan, on the 9th floor of this old, run-down building. It was the kind of place that looked nice on the outside, with shiny windows and a fancy lobby. But once you were inside, you could tell it hadn't been updated in decades. The lights flickered sometimes, the floors creaked, and there was always this strange, stale smell in the air, like old carpet and dust. I was the junior analyst, fresh out of college, so I was usually stuck working late. Most of my coworkers were gone by 6, and the cleaning staff came around 7, which meant from then until midnight, I was almost always the last one in the office. It wasn't so bad at first. I enjoyed the quiet, and it helped me get my work done without distractions. But over time, I started noticing things, small, weird things that made me uneasy. It started with noises. The building was old, so I was used to the occasional groan of the pipes or the hum of the heating system kicking in, but these were different. I'd be typing away at my desk when I'd hear it, a faint scratching sound coming from the ceiling vents above me. It was soft, almost like the sound of nails on metal, just enough to catch my attention, but never loud enough to make out clearly. At first, I brushed it off, thinking maybe it was rats or just the old building settling. But then the sounds started getting more frequent and closer. Sometimes, late at night, I'd hear soft tapping, like something was crawling through the vents, slowly making its way through the ceiling. I tried to ignore it, but every night it would start up again, scratching, tapping, and sometimes even faint whispers, like a breeze passing through the metal ducts. One night, I was finishing up a report when I heard a noise that was different. It was louder, more distinct, like something heavy being dragged across the metal. I paused, staring up at the vent above my desk, and that's when I heard it, breathing. Slow, deliberate, like someone was lying just on the other side of the metal grate, trying to be quiet. My heart started pounding in my chest. I told myself it was just the ventilation system, or maybe even my mind playing tricks on me after working too many late nights. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, climbing up on my desk to get a closer look. I shined the light into the vent, my hand trembling slightly. At first, I saw nothing but darkness. The beam from my phone barely cut through the dust and grime, but as I moved the light around, I caught a glimpse of something that made my blood run cold, 2 eyes staring back at me. They were dull, lifeless, reflecting the light in a way that made them look almost inhuman. They didn't blink or move, just stared unblinking, watching me from the shadows of the vent. I stumbled back, nearly falling off the desk. My phone slipped out of my hand, leaving me in near darkness. I jumped down from my desk and ran to the door, my heart racing as I slammed it shut behind me, locking it. I leaned against the door, breathing heavily, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. The vent looked quite narrow, and I couldn't believe anyone could fit in there. And yet, I was certain of what I saw. Those eyes, they were human, but at the same time, they weren't. There was something off about them, something that didn't make sense. I called security, my voice shaky as I tried to explain what happened. When they arrived, they searched the vents thoroughly, but found nothing. No sign of rats, no debris, and certainly no one hiding inside. The head of security, an older guy named Frank, gave me a look of pity, like he'd seen this kind of thing before. "It's an old building," he said, almost dismissively. "You'd be surprised what noises it makes." I wanted to believe him, to chalk it up to my imagination, but I couldn't forget those eyes, cold, empty, and watching. I tried to put it out of my mind and continued working late nights, but the noises never stopped. If anything, they got worse. I'd hear the scratching start as soon as the cleaning crew left, always in the vents above my desk, always just out of sight. Sometimes it would sound like faint footsteps moving from one side of the ceiling to the other, stopping directly above me. One night, I was working on a tight deadline, trying to ignore the noises when I heard something that made my skin crawl. A faint whisper, just audible over the hum of my computer. It was my name.
Matthew.
The voice was low and gravelly, almost like a hiss. I froze, every hair on my body standing on end. I looked up at the vent, and for the first time, I saw movement, a slight shifting of shadows, like something was crawling just beyond the grate. I grabbed my things, leaving my computer on, and bolted out of the office, not even bothering to lock up. As I sprinted down the hallway, I swore I could hear the whispering following me, growing fainter the farther I got. The next day, I requested to work from home, citing personal reasons. I never went back to that office again, and I left the company a month later. I don't know what was in those vents, and I don't think I ever want to find out. But sometimes, late at night, when my house is quiet, I still hear it. The faint scratching, the slow, deliberate breathing, and that voice, calling my name from somewhere I can't see. I've checked my vents a dozen times since then, but they're always empty. Still, I can't shake the feeling that whatever was watching me that night is still out there, waiting in the dark, just out of sight. I live in a quiet suburb where everyone knows each other, a typical sleepy neighborhood where the most exciting thing is a garage sale or a new family moving in. It's the kind of place where people leave their doors unlocked. Kids play in the streets until dark, and you know everyone's routines. That's why it was so strange when I noticed something unusual with Mrs. Harrison, my neighbor. Mrs. Harrison lived alone after her husband passed away a few years ago. She was the sweet grandmotherly type, always tending to her garden or baking cookies for the kids in the neighborhood. We'd wave to each other nearly every day, but one night everything changed. It was around 2 a.m. when I woke up, thirsty. I remember feeling disoriented as I got out of bed and walked toward the kitchen. On my way, I glanced out the large living room window, the one that overlooked our street. That's when I saw her, Mrs. Harrison, standing in the middle of her yard, bathed in the dim orange glow of the streetlight. At first, I thought nothing of it. Maybe she was letting her cat out or getting the newspaper. But then I realized how odd it was for her to be out this late. She was just standing there, facing my house, completely still. Her posture was rigid, her head slightly tilted, and her eyes locked on my bedroom window. The more I watched her, the more uneasy I felt. Her face was blank, devoid of any emotion, just a blank stare that sent a shiver down my spine. She didn't blink or look away, not even once. She just stood there, like a statue, eyes fixed on my house. I opened the window a crack and called out.
Mrs. Harrison, are you all right?
My voice sounded too loud in the silent night, echoing off the empty street. But she didn't respond. She didn't even flinch. It was as if she couldn't hear me at all, or worse, she didn't care. I stared at her, waiting for her to move, but she remained frozen, her gaze never shifting. I felt an unsettling chill crawl up my spine, and I quickly shut the window, pulling the curtains closed. I told myself it was none of my business. Maybe she was sleepwalking or confused, and I tried to shake it off. But I couldn't get the image of her out of my mind. Her figure silhouetted against the streetlight, her pale face staring into the darkness, completely devoid of life. I sat on the edge of my bed, listening, half expecting to hear her footsteps on my porch. I peeked through the curtains a few more times, and every time she was still there, motionless, eyes locked on my window. I finally forced myself to lie down, convincing myself she'd go back inside eventually. But sleep didn't come easy, and when I woke up in the morning, the first thing I did was rush to the window. She was gone. The yard was empty, and everything looked normal, almost too normal. I tried to forget about it, chalking it up to a weird late-night occurrence. But later that morning, I heard the sound of sirens. I looked out and saw police cars and an ambulance parked outside Mrs. Harrison's house. My stomach dropped. I threw on some clothes and went outside to see what was happening. There were police officers everywhere, talking to neighbors and yellow tape blocking off her yard. I approached one of the officers, my voice shaky as I asked, "What's going on?" "Is Mrs. Harrison all right?" The officer glanced at me, his face grim. "Mrs. Harrison has been missing for 2 days. We found her car abandoned on the outskirts of town. We're doing everything we can to find her." I stared at him, my mind racing. "That's impossible. I saw her last night. She was in her yard, staring at my house. I thought she was acting strange, but I swear it was her." The officer's expression hardened. "That's not possible," he said slowly. "We recovered Mrs. Harrison's body yesterday morning. She was found near the river, about 10 miles from here. She's been dead for at least 2 days." I felt the blood drain from my face. "No, you don't understand. I saw her. She was right there," I insisted, pointing to her empty yard. The officer looked at me like I was crazy, like he didn't believe a word I was saying. I stumbled back to my house, my mind reeling. How could she be dead? I saw her. She was right there. I spent the rest of the day replaying it over and over in my head, trying to make sense of it. I even checked my doorbell camera footage, hoping to prove that I wasn't losing my mind. But when I reviewed the tape, there was nothing. No one in the yard, no figure in the dark. Just an empty street. I tried to convince myself that I was just seeing things, that maybe I was half asleep, but it never sat right with me. I saw her. I know I did. And every night since, when I look out my window, I feel that same unsettling feeling, like someone's watching me from the darkness. Sometimes, I think I catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye, a shadow in her yard, a faint shape that disappears the moment I try to focus on it. The neighborhood's quiet now, quieter than ever, but there's this lingering sense of something wrong, something unfinished. And I still can't shake the feeling that Mrs. Harrison's not really gone, not completely.